Well, hello Dragons, and welcome to this instructional video for Lesson 9, Part 4, Inflation. The main idea behind this economics lesson is economists analyze price fluctuations by examining the price level, inflation, and deflation. With that in mind, by the end of watching this video, you'll be able to explain how economists evaluate price changes over time, describe what causes inflation, identify the two main price indexes that economists use to measure inflation, and explain how inflation affects the economy. Now that the outcomes for this lesson have been shared with you, let's get started. As noted in Lesson 5, when quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, prices go up and the purchasing power of a dollar goes down. When quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, prices go down and the purchasing power of the dollar goes up. These changes in prices and the purchasing power of money have many immediate and far-reaching effects for society and can threaten the stability of a nation's economy. To understand the effects of these forces, economists study price changes throughout the economy. When discussing prices, economists talk about the price level, inflation, and deflation. The price level reflects prices throughout the economy at a particular time. Inflation and deflation refer to changes in the price level over time. The price level influences aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Aggregate supply is the total amount of goods and services produced throughout the economy. As noted in Lesson 4, the law of supply states that quantity supplied increases as prices rise. Similarly, the aggregate quantity of goods supplied is likely to be higher when the price level is higher. Aggregate demand is the total amount of spending by individuals and businesses throughout the economy. The law of demand applies to aggregate demand, which means that there is a greater aggregate quantity of products demanded when the price level is lower. Although the price level reflects a particular point in time, it is used for comparative purposes. For example, economists may compare today's price level with price levels in 2000 or 2005 to see how the economy has changed. An increase in the average price level of all products in an economy is called inflation. Usually, inflation occurs when aggregate demand increases faster than aggregate supply. When quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, consumers must compete for limited products and prices go up. As prices increase, the amount that the dollar buys decreases. Thus, inflation reduces the real purchasing power of the dollar. A decrease in the average price level of all goods and services in an economy is known as deflation. Deflation may occur when aggregate demand decreases more rapidly than aggregate supply. In such situations, sellers are forced to lower prices to attract buyers. As prices decrease, the amount a dollar buys increases. Thus, deflation boosts the real purchasing power of the dollar. The most prolonged and most recent deflationary period in U.S. history occurred during the Great Depression, when high unemployment coupled with reductions in wages caused aggregate demand and prices to fall. Economists classify inflation into two general categories based on cause: demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Prices can either be pulled up by high demand or pushed up by high production costs. In addition, expectations about future prices strongly affect inflation. When aggregate demand increases faster than the economy's productive capacity, Demand pull inflation results. Following the laws of supply and demand, prices increase when quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. As demand continues to increase, the prices of goods are pulled even higher. Demand pull inflation can result from an increase in the money supply or an increase in the use of credit. The Federal Reserve System, commonly known as the Fed, controls the money supply in the United States. When the Fed increases the supply of money and credit, aggregate demand increases as consumers, businesses, and governments purchase more goods. Spending thus outpaces the available supply of goods, and demand pull inflation results. Economists refer to this situation as too much money chasing too few goods. When producers raise prices to cover higher resource costs, cost push inflation results. As noted in Lesson 4, resource costs are one of the determinants of supply. Producers must set prices high enough to cover their costs and to earn a profit. Thus, increased production costs push producers to raise prices even if demand has not increased. Supply shocks are one of many sources of cost push inflation. A supply shock is an event that increases the cost of production for all or many firms, resulting in overall higher prices. Crop failures, natural disasters, and political upheavals can cause supply shocks. As noted in Part 2, for example, in 1973 and 1974, members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, quadrupled the price of oil after a war with Israel. Producers in the United States had to raise prices to cover increased energy costs. The result was a ripple of price increases for everything from gasoline and home heating oil to plastics and cosmetics. By 1974, inflation had spiked to 11%, up from 6% in 1973. The relationship between wages and prices can also lead to cost push inflation. Suppose that a worker bargains for a wage increase. These higher wages, when paid to workers throughout the economy, encourage producers to raise prices, continuing the cycle. Some economists refer to this cycle as the wage price spiral. Expectations about future prices can affect inflation. When consumers expect prices to increase, they tend to buy immediately to take advantage of lower prices. As a result, aggregate demand increases and inflation rises. When consumers expect future prices to be lower, they are likely to postpone buying, which decreases aggregate demand and slows inflation. Similarly, producers adjust prices to match their expectations of future inflation. When producers expect inflation to increase, they raise prices. As prices continue to rise, consumers' and producers' expectations of future inflation grow even more, and prices spiral upward. When measuring price level fluctuations, economists look at changes in the average price level of goods and services in a nation. They look at the average price level as opposed to specific prices, because in any given period the prices of some goods are rising while the prices of others are falling. Even though specific items might be cheaper than they used to be, if most items are more expensive, then the purchasing power of the dollar in general has decreased. To measure the price level, economists construct a price index. The two most common price indexes are the Consumer Price Index and the Producer Price Index. When news reports declare that inflation is up or down, they are usually referring to a change in the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is a measure of the average change over time in the price of a fixed group of products. The Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates and reports the CPI each month. First, the Bureau selects a base year against which to measure price changes. Currently, the CPI is based on the period 1982 to 1984 instead of a single base year. Second, the Bureau selects a representative sample of commonly purchased consumer items called the market basket. This sample includes items that the typical urban consumer might buy, such as food, clothing, shelter, utilities, transportation, entertainment, and healthcare. Each item in the market basket is weighed based on its importance in consumers' budgets. The Bureau then samples the prices of these goods and services in selected areas across the nation. Some prices are reviewed every month, others every other month. Every 8 to 10 years, the Bureau of Labor Statistics conducts a survey to identify items that should be included in the market basket. Economists set the price index for the base year at 100. To calculate the CPI for another year, the Bureau determines the price of the market basket for that year, divides the amount by the cost of the market basket in the base year, and multiplies the result by 100. For example, if the market basket cost $4,000 in 82 to 84 and $7,000 in a later year, the CPI for the later year would be 175. The average price level in the later year is 75% higher than it was in the period of 1982 to 1984. In other words, purchasing power has declined, and consumers must spend 175% of the cost from 1982 to 1984. The Producer Price Index, or PPI, is a measure of the average changes over time in the prices of goods and services bought by producers. PPIs are compiled for selected types of products as well as for production stages of particular industries. Price data are based on some 3,200 products. The current base year for the PPI is 1982, and like the CPI base year, has a value of 100. Economists use price indexes like the CPI to calculate the inflation rate, the monthly or annual percentage change in prices. To use the CPI to calculate the inflation rate from one year to another, economists use the formula inflation rate equals the quantity CPI year B minus CPI year A divided by CPI year A times 100. For example, if the price level of CPI is 140 in year A and 145 in year B, the inflation rate is 3.57% for that period. Most economists consider inflation rates from 1 to 3% to be low to moderate, with inflation rates of less than 1% to be negligible. Depending on the severity of the inflation rate, economists may describe it as creeping or galloping. Hyperinflation, the worst degree of inflation, is a situation in which inflation is increasing at a rate of several 100% a year. Hyperinflation can result in complete economic collapse. After Germany lost World War I, for example, it was forced to pay heavy reparations to the victorious countries. Germany tried to pay this debt simply by printing more money. By November 15, 1923, it took 4.2 trillion marks, which was the German currency, to equal the value of $1 US, meaning that the mark was worth so little that even the paper on which it was printed had greater value. Although inflation benefits some people, it affects most people negatively. Inflation causes changes in the purchasing power of the dollar, the value of real wages, interest rates, saving and investing, and production costs. You may have heard an older family member or friend talk about how inexpensive things were when they were young. They are discussing one of the effects of inflation, decreased purchasing power. The decreasing value of the dollar particularly hurts people on fixed incomes. As the value of the dollar falls, the purchasing power of people who rely on set pension checks or other fixed income decreases as well. To combat this problem, many labor contracts, government benefits, and retirement plans include cost of living adjustments, or COLAs. COLAs automatically raise wages or payments to account for inflation. Inflation also reduces the value of workers' real wages when pay increases fail to keep pace with rising prices. For example, suppose that Donald earned $20,000 in 1979 and $40,000 in 2009. In current dollars, Donald's $40,000 salary is double what he made in 1979. Once Donald's 2009 income has been adjusted for inflation, however, it becomes clear that his purchasing power has remained about the same. Therefore, his salary increases just enabled him to keep pace with the cost of living. Overall, wages tend to stay ahead of or at the pace of inflation. As prices increase, interest rates, the price of borrowing money, tend to increase as well. High interest rates can decrease consumer spending, particularly on goods that are usually purchased on credit or through loans, such as computers, automobiles, and houses. High interest rates can double or even triple consumers' monthly credit card or loan payments. The inflation rate also affects the return that people receive from their savings and investments. For example, suppose that Jody deposited $2,000 in a savings account yielding 5% interest. After a period of 5 years, during which time the inflation rate averaged 7%, she withdrew her savings, which had grown to $2,550. Although Jody has more money than when she started, she has lost money overall because inflation was running at a higher rate than the interest she earned on her savings. As a result, the purchasing power of Jody's savings has declined. High inflation thus tends to discourage saving. Businesses that issue long-term bonds with interest rates lower than the inflation rate benefit from inflation. For the most part, however, high inflation rates hurt businesses because inflation increases their costs of production. Businesses that can pass these additional costs on to buyers survive. Consumers, however, may refuse to pay the higher prices. So that's the way it is with Lesson 9, Part 4, Inflation. At this point, you should know that inflation is an increase in the average price level of all goods and services in the economy, while deflation is a decrease in the average price level of products. Economists use both the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and the Producer Price Index, PPI, to measure the amount of price fluctuations, and inflation affects the purchasing power of the dollar, the value of real wages, interest rates, saving and investing, and production costs. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to have the entire catalog of economics videos available at your fingertips. Click the subscribe button and then click the follow bell to receive notifications as to when the channel is updated. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in class, Dragons.